Do you remember your first day at Filmation?
At Filmation? Yeah, because that time period in 1982, 82 going into 83. So I was working for Richard Williams on a TV special. Dick had a studio in Los Angeles. And so me and Eric Goldberg, we completed that TV special. And then the studio didn't really have anything for a while, so it was dry. And we had just gone through a strike. There was a big trade union strike in 1982 to try to keep work inside Los Angeles from getting sent out, outsourced. And it was very a tough strike. A lot of people were, lost a lot of money. So when Filmation came up, it's like, wow, this is, really good job. It's like year-round employment. There was a lot of work to do. And so I was happy to be doing it. And then I had been animating on the other shows. And on this one, I said, I want to do storyboard. Because I thought doing storyboard would be something different. So I storyboard. I did do some animation on it too. But I remember when I was working on the He-Man show, I turned to my friend next to me, Don Manuel, and I said, Don, the name of this show isn't really He-Man, right? That's like a temporary name. Maybe that's just a temporary title. Maybe it's like Ragnar, Karnak. No, it's He-Man. Yeah. Okay. Storyboarded a lot of the movie Secret of the Sword. I did about a third of that show, and then I was directing on She-Ra. So I directed a bunch of She-Ras and getting to do those episodes, and that was fun.
Still going back to He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, in those early stages of development, have you ever imagined that it would become such a big thing, planetary hit?
I know. I'm so surprised because of all the shows that I did in the 1980s, He-Man's the only one where there's still fans. Like I still get invited to conventions, to like fan conventions and all about He-Man, and I'm like when I started, it was just a job to me, and it's become such a phenomenon. It's like it's memories for so many people. And I'll go to these festivals and I'll say, what was your inspiration when you did show MU-37, Castle of Heroes? I'm like, I pay my rent, like I pay my credit cards. But that show just has staying power with people, that they all loved it.
There seems to be this trend in the 80s coming from, I believe, Rosetta aesthetics. Mm-hmm. Of sword and sorcery in kids shows. You mentioned the Black Cauldron, for example, and other shows of Hanna-Barbera.
Was Ralph Bakshi on Lord of the Rings?
Yeah. In hindsight, what do you see as elements that contributed for this enduring quality of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe? Was it just the marketing and Mattel's effort surrounding the show, or do you find, as an historian and as an educator, something particular about the show that justifies this enduring quality?
Well, I think the secret with He-Man was starting in the mid '70s, the late '70s, when they developed the game Dungeons and Dragons, and a lot of young people going through college were reading Tolkien. They're all reading The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And there was this sort of fascination with this sort of sword and sorcery kind of culture. And with modern culture being so complex, with like Watergate and the Vietnam War and the counterculture, and it was sort of a societal exhaustion. I think around the time Nixon resigned. And there was a yearning for simplicity, kind of like the way our grandparents' society worshiped cowboys. Like the idea about cowboys is that there isn't a lot of, there's not a class system. It's not about status. It's about you and your gun out in the desert and, trying to survive. But from my generation, the cowboy was kind of played out. There was so much, Bonanza and all the cowboy movies, that by the late 60s, people were like, they were tired of that. So the sword and sorcery thing had a kind of an appeal to it. The other thing that happened was, starting about 1978 to about 1982, there was the first video game, the first interactive game craze, which was like Space Invaders and Pac-Man and Donkey Kong and all those games that you played, in a video arcade. And then later on, when people started to get laptops, they got some of the earliest games, Pong and, all those things, Q*bert, all that stuff. And there was a big rush. There was like a boom of interactive games. And the authorities at the time in the early 80s were saying, nobody's going to play with toys anymore. Nobody's going to play with Barbie or G.I. Joe. They're just going to play video games all the time. And like anything else, it reached its it reached its saturation point where the public just got bored of all these things. There's so many of them. There were so many knockoffs and low budget versions of things that they just kind of. So in 1983, there was a big interactive game crash, where like suddenly all those Coleco and Intellivision and Atari were suddenly like in very bad shape. They suddenly lost a lot of revenue, where people got sick of video games. They were burying video games in landfills in the trash. They were like trucks full of these things, just dumping them. So right around the time this interactive game craze had reached its exhaustion, here's He-Man. And it's a simple, all it is, it's a hero and a villain with no instructions, with no wires, with nothing complicated. You just, you just play with the good guy and the bad guy, and the good guy's obvious and the bad guy's obvious, and they just, and. I mean, in a way, that was kind of like the appeal of Star Wars, because when Star Wars came out, all the movies were all movies about social consciousness and corruption. The Godfather and the French Connection, and it's all about the government's corrupt and we're corrupt, and we did terrible things to the Indians and we did terrible things to our minorities. And Star Wars was just this silly, let's have fun, good guys, bad guys, and shoot lasers. And everybody went, yeah. And it was like a big craze. So I think there's an opportunity gets created, and something comes, something falls in at the right time. And I think He-Man hit right when that first interactive game craze was crashing. And because at the time we were doing the series, the toy was already the best-selling toy in the world. Like, even before this series. And the series just cemented it, just made it even bigger, So there was something about the toy that everybody just enjoyed. Did you ever hear the story about the origin of He-Man and the connection with Arnold Schwarzenegger?
I heard about Conan the Barbarian, that they wanted to put Conan the Barbarian into a cartoon, but it was far too violent to market to kids.
Yeah, they made a deal. Yeah, they made a deal with Mattel to market toys on Conan, and the director, John Milius, wound up making a much more adult movie, much more sexual and violent than they thought it would. In the meantime, they have warehouses in China full of these little figures. And they go, what do we do? So let's just change it a little bit, change the design, change the hair and stuff. And then that was it. So then it's like He-Man. Like, okay. Still in Filmation, Tom. You also got your first break as a director with Fat Albert, Ghostbusters, She-Ra, Bravestarr.
Of all the projects that you have been involved in Filmation, which one was the one that marked you the most, and what were the most important lessons that you have learned while working at the studios?
Oh, okay. Well, I'd say of the things that I directed there, I liked directing Ghostbusters. That was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot on that. And directing She-Ra and everything was fun, and then some Bravestarr also. What I learned the difference between being a director and being an artist, and again, my old teacher Shamus Culhane from years ago, because I would talk to him about as I was going through my own problems, because I knew that he ran a studio and he directed shows, and so he would help me like daddy director to baby director, and he taught me. He said, directing has nothing to do with your ability to draw. It has nothing to do with your ability as an artist. It's your ability to motivate people with your personality. He said, because nobody's asking you to draw anything. That's their job. That's what they do. You have to motivate them and get them excited about the project, and then you have to have the good taste to recognize good ideas and inject them into your show. And over the years, I've seen people like Brad Bird, who did The Iron Giant. Brad is very good with his crew. Like his crew, his team of artists are so motivated working for him that he has a great way. Sorry, that's my cat. So anyway, Brad has a great way of inspiring his crew, and they all love working. They all love working with him. And I realized like it is sort of a leadership thing, and to me, like the best directors were people who had done all the jobs previously, so they have an understanding and a respect for what for what the other people are doing. Like I always likened it to, we have a phrase called the GI General, which is like you're general, but you're still like getting a hole next to the private. Or there was a story of Alexander the Great confronting some of his rebellious soldiers, and he said to them, "You strip your shirt, and I'll strip mine, and we'll compare scars." Because I'm just as many as yours. And people respect that. They go, yeah. Dick Williams was a great motivator also. You wanted to do your best work for Dick, because Dick never worked himself harder. So he never worked people as hard as he worked himself, but he worked himself very hard. So he would do all night, things. So you would do all night things because you want to match Dick. Because like if Dick's killing himself, then okay, I'll kill myself. Well, like the Saturday morning things like Filmation and those shows, we didn't do that kind of overtime because it was more of the business. It was more like the as long as the shows hit their numbers, everybody's happy. So we don't have to, work till dawn or anything like that.
How do you remember Lou Scheimer, and how do you position him in the history of animation?
Well, Lou was a lovely man. Lou also was an artist. I mean, he was originally a layout artist. And he had worked on a lot of television in the '60s and all before he started his company, and he was very generous with people. He hated to lay anybody off. Like we would always make jokes about hey Lou, such and such artist had an accident and lost his hands. And he'd go, okay, well we'll put him in the storage department, and he can stack scenes. like Lou would always find things for people to do. And he had a very big heart that way. And if it was under a party or anything like that, like Lou would fit the bill. He would do the whole thing. I was once teasing him I was once joking with him, like I went to a party at his house, and he had this big, beautiful house up in the hill, up in the Hollywood Hills, this big mansion. And I told him, I said, He-Man bought my first house. Like, I called my house Casa de He-Man. So, because He-Man paid for it. And Lou looked at me and he goes, the Archies. The Archies paid for mine. Sugar, da 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 da, honey, honey. that was Lou's moneymaker. So, I originally, I grew up in New York City, and my father was a fireman, and my uncles all drove trucks, and the idea that I was going to be an artist, that they would look at me and go, so what do you want to do, like Mickey Mouse or something? It's like, you can make a living doing that? Like, yeah.
I remember reading that when you were a young man, you were first enamored with comic strips. What were your favorite authors and strips?
Oh, well, growing up in New York City, we had large major newspapers. And so we had what is called the Sunday Funnies, which was on the Sunday there'd be a big color section of comic strips, and it was all like Charlie Brown and Al Cap, Little Abner, and a lot of the things, different comic strips like that. There's some Hal Foster, the Prince Valiant. And then in the 60s, it was all comic books. So I loved all the Marvel stuff, all the Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and all of that. Was like the heyday of the first Marvel characters. And I originally thought that I wanted to do something like that. I wanted to do a comic strip. And then a teacher in school showed me how to animate and how to make things move. And I was like, wow, I want to do that. That's what a great idea, And then I found out you could actually make a living doing that. And it's like, ooh, that's nice.
Besides being impacted by the way you could work in animation, was there any particular mentor or decisive moment on your formation that made you feel that your future could really be in the field of the moving image?
Well, I believe I fell in love with making animation, and very early on, like out of high school, I got into college, and my old teacher was a fellow named Gil Moret, and he was a layout person at Paramount Studios and working for Terry Toons. So he was doing like Heckle and Jekyll and some of those things, Tom Terrific, whatever, designed by Gene Deitch. And he was a great influence on me. And he introduced me to a friend of his named Shamus Culhane. And Shamus, of course, was an animator. He lived in New York, but he was an ex-Disney animator. And he worked on Snow White and Pinocchio. And like at this point in his career, he was very old. But he had done all those amazing things. He married the daughter of Chico Marx of the Marx Brothers. It's like he had a fascinating career, fascinating life, and I just learned so much from him. He was so inspiring. And he really kind of looked at me like another son, I think, and I enjoyed his company. But I think that's where I first really caught the bug and said, this is what I want to do, from now on.
Your first big break was under Richard Williams' wing, and you then proceeded to work in Hanna-Barbera projects such as Super Friends and Godzilla. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a bit about these early times working as a professional?
Yeah, animation in the 1970s was sort of going through a low period. Which is the Walt Disney died, Max Fleischer died. The studios were reorganizing themselves around television instead of theatrical cartoons. A lot of UPA closed. A lot of the the Warner Brothers studio that we would know as Warner Brothers, they closed about 1969. And Friz Freleng took the remainder and formed the Patty Freleng to do Pink Panther cartoons. And Chuck Jones formed his own unit to do things like The Grinch Who Stole Christmas. So there wasn't a lot of work. Most of the work was commercials, and it was a little bit in New York and LA. And Disney, after Walt Disney's death, the studio was kind of shrinking. And like the majority of their income was from the park. So it's actually the parks and their cheap and their live action movies. Like around the time that they did Sleeping Beauty in 1958. 59, Sleeping Beauty, like they spent a lot of money and it was huge, but it didn't really create the kind of box office they thought it should. It under earned. Meanwhile, they made like a low budget comedy called The Shaggy Dog, which was a couple of teenagers and one guy in a doggy suit and a hot rod, and that made a ton of money for them. That was like a gigantic hit. So Walt Disney was like, So the studio shrank, like from about 450, it was down to at one point down to 75. Then it was up to about 120 employees. And they were mostly old people. They were people who had been there for 30, 40 years, and they weren't leaving, It wasn't until the mid-70s that the Disney artists suddenly thought, oh my God, we're mortal. We better start training people because we're going to be dead. But it took them until about the mid-1970s to go, oh my God, we've got to train people. Because nobody else was doing it. It was Hanna-Barbera. Everything was television, all like low-budget TV stuff. So Richard Williams was kind of an exception. Richard Williams had made his career doing commercials, but he loved character animation so much, and he wanted to preserve that heritage of character animation. I said it kind of reminded me of that story, The Name of the Rose, about the medieval monks trying to save ancient manuscripts and literature. Yeah. So Dick was like one of those monks. He was trying to save ancient wisdom of the 9 old men and the Warner Brothers masters. In 1972, he actually shut down his studio for 2 months just so they could retrain under Chuck Jones and Art Babbitt. And so Dick was a great one for introducing young people to old masters. So when I had a chance to work for Dick Williams, as an assistant, he would have me assist Grim Natwick, and it's like Grim Natwick's the guy who created Betty Boop. Like he sat with a blank piece of paper and created Betty Boop, and he was the lead animator on Snow White. And so I was terrified. I was so scared that I was going to mess up. But I learned so much from them. And I got to know Art Babbitt really well, who created Goofy and Geppetto. And Art was a great teacher. And I learned I learned so much just working underneath them and learning all their maxims and messages. And what they taught us, they didn't just teach us because they liked us. They were hoping that the things that they discovered that would be moved on to future generations, so that we would take their lessons and would live on. It would live on through us to them. So that's why, I teach so much now, because I take it as a sacred duty that they gave me my career, and this is what they wanted us to do, was to move it on. Otherwise, everything would die with them. Again, Gil Moret, my old teacher, used to say, the problem with animation and film is every couple of years, some young person announces they've invented the pan, which is when you take a camera and you go like that. Meaning everybody does that. That's been done for a long time. Do something, learn, invent something new. Instead of rediscovering old stuff, So there's working on those old traditions, And then I figured out later when I was teaching that a lot of these traditions transcend even the technology, because when people started doing 3D CGI and all, you still have traditional animation skills in order to function. You still have to understand timing and character and posing and accents and all. And so all that stuff, it's like I say, it's like English actors who love Shakespeare. It's like Shakespeare never goes away. It's always Shakespeare. And so that kind of Disney Warner Brothers character animation never goes away. Like it's still popular. Like the styles will change. The styles will go from very realistic to very graphic to very realistic to very graphic. It kind of goes back and forth. But the timing and the characterization, that kind of stuff, like always remains.
So relatively to Hanna-Barbera, is there any particular moment?
Yeah. When I was working in Hanna-Barbera in the late 70s, so about 1977, 78, and it's when Hanna-Barbera was at its largest in terms of people. And what was amazing about Hanna-Barbera was it was like a big factory. It was like a huge studio. And Disney at this point was like an old folks home of like 120 old people. Well, Hanna-Barbera was this big, they were doing like 12 series. And they were doing series around the world. They were doing series in Spain. They were doing series in Hong Kong, in Australia, in Korea. But they had all these different, projects going. And what was fascinating about walking around Hanna-Barbera was I was fortunate that when I began my career in the 70s, a lot of those golden age animators were ending their careers. So a lot of them who had started in the 1930s, they were now like in their 60s and they were retiring or dying off. But all of them were working at Hanna-Barbera at one time or another. Like Bill and Joe, Hanna-Barbera always gave work to a lot of these old artists. So just as a young person, you'd walk around the studio and all the guys who did Tom and Jerry are still there. So it's like Ed Barge and Ken Muse and Ray Patterson, and Mike Law. And, Mike Law was the main animator for Tex Avery. Tex Avery was there. And, then I met Dave Tendler. And Dave Tendler was an animator for Max Fleischer on Betty Boops and Popeyes in the 1930s. And then, you go up another block, like to the next room. And then there would be like Nick Nichols, who was like a Disney animator, and Hal Ambro, who was another great Disney animator, and Charlie Downs. So there was so many great artists at that place, cranking out the television. And like I said, like some of them were very elderly. There was this fellow named Ken Muse, and Ken was a genius animator in his time. He was a fantastic animator. He did a lot of that beautiful animation of Jerry the Mouse dancing with Gene Kelly in Anchors Away. So just beautiful work. But he was so elderly at this point and so broken down from, he was like burned out. He needed two canes. So he had these two canes that he would walk and hobble around with, these two canes. And what the guys would do is while he was working, somebody would take his canes, they'd take the rubber tip off and saw off an inch and put the rubber tip back on. And then the next day they would take off another inch. So slowly he was lower and lower and lower. It's so mean. It's so gross. But it was funny. I mean, that kind of stuff happened in studios all the time. But it was an amazing place because there was so much activity, so busy. And Bill and Joe were very, they were nice to work with, although they were very old-fashioned in that, in the modern day, like Steven Spielberg doesn't like to be called Mr. Spielberg. He likes to be called Steven, and Michael Eisner was Michael, and Bob Zemeckis was Bob. Hanna-Barbera, it was Mr. Hanna and Mr. Barbera. Like, you didn't call them Bill and Joe. Like, unless you worked with them on Tom and Jerry in the 40s, they could call them Bill and Joe. But young people like me, it's Mr. Hanna and Mr. Barbera.
There are times.
Yeah, and we had ex-people from Ralph Bakshi and ex-people from Chuck Jones's group. They were all there. there was an animator from Ralph Bakshi who we were doing the Godzilla show, the Godzilla Power Hour, and there was one layout artist who would draw the little character Gadzuki. So there was Godzilla, and then Gadzuki was the baby Godzilla, and he drew Gadzuki with a big penis, like a big like. It was very funny. I mean, nobody will ever see it, but it was very funny when it was done. But it was a great studio, you know. And again too, it's like you could, because it was like the amount of animation you would turn out, and you get paid bonuses if you went over a certain amount and all. And so we were doing Godzilla, we were doing Super Friends, we were doing Jana the Jungle, and just starting Heidi. And then at Ruby Spears, which was the side company, Joe Ruby and Ken Spears started their stuff. That was Fang Face, and then in the 80s they were doing stuff like Qbert and Galtar and things like that.